Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the immediate past president of the American College of Sports Medicine, Dr. Bill Dexter.
Wow, I feel good. I knew that I wouldn't. I feel good. I knew that I wouldn't.
Woo! All right. So I first want to start by thanking Nicole and Dahia for leading us this morning in a quick instant recess in memory of Dr. Tony Yancey, allowing us to start the day together being physically active. When a long-term member of the American College of Sports Medicine reaches retirement, that person can apply for and be awarded the designation of either member emeritus or fellow emeritus of the college. A continuing interest in the college is an excellent indication of the continued dedication to regional and national sports medicine activities. Serving as welcoming hosts at the entrance doorways for this year's Dill Historical Lecture were emeriti who are participating in this year's annual meeting, with several of them being past presidents of the American College of Sports Medicine. I'd like to introduce another group of elite members of the college. In 2011, the ACSM Board of Trustees approved a category of legacy members in an effort to honor unique contributions of senior individuals who have contributed significantly to ACSM in the past. This group consists of living past presidents, past honor award recipients, and past Wolf lecturers beginning 26 years after the end of the individual's presidency, award, or lecture. We currently have 27 individuals in this category. A complete listing of these folks can be found on page 3 in the final program, and I would encourage you to peruse through that, because it's really a blast to see who's in that list. We're honored to have 8 of these 27 in attendance with us today. They include Jerome Dempsey, Barbara Drinkwater, John Halozzi, Skip Nutkin, Henry Miller, Peter Raven, James Skinner, and Charles Tipton. Congratulations to each of those. On behalf of ACSM, thanks for all you do at the college, and I really appreciate the round of applause for this legacy group. So now we'll get to the matter at hand. The D. Bruce Dill Historical Lecture is named after a pioneering scientist who made fundamental contributions to our understanding of the human physiological and metabolic responses to exercise. And this keynote lecture deals with the history of sports medicine and exercise science. And it's in the memory of one of ACSM's past presidents and prominent figures in the development of sports medicine and exercise in America, D. Bruce Dill, Ph.D. I've had the distinct pleasure of working with our D.B. Dill speaker in various capacities over the years on the Board of Trustees, and we were in Brazil a couple of years together representing the American College of Sports Medicine. And he shared with me a few tidbits which I'd like to share with you in his introduction, and I'll do that in a moment. As the immediate past president of ACSM, I've had the wonderful opportunity during my presidency years and years in leadership to meet and work with the most extraordinary and extraordinarily brilliant and talented individuals, and today's speaker is one of them. I have the great honor of introducing our D.B. Dill Historical Lecturer today, Dr. Ronald J Monde. Dr. Ronald Monde obtained his Bachelor of Science in Physiology and his Ph.D. from the University of Aberdeen, and was a lecturer in Liverpool before returning to Aberdeen, where he was based in the medical school for almost 25 years. He was then professor of sport and exercise nutrition at Loughborough University for 10 years, and now has an emeritus position there. He spent much of his career working on a range of projects that have attempted to understand the physiological responses to exercise and the nature of fatigue, but he has included many digressions along the way. And we should all have such productive digressions. He chairs the Sports Nutrition Working Group of the Medical Commission of the International Olympics Committee, also chairs the Science Advisory Board of the European Hydration Institute. He publishes extensively in the scientific literature and is author and editor of a number of books on sports nutrition and exercise biochemistry. But more importantly, Ron shared with me that he would like to be remembered as all the things he is not: tall, dark, handsome, and unfathomably wealthy. You can decide at the conclusion of his remarks today whether those apply to Ron. For now, please join me in learning more about landmarks in the development of sports nutrition from Dr. Monde. Dr. Monde, please come to the podium.
Thank you very much, Dex, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and a great privilege to stand on this stage today and follow in the footsteps of some of the great lecturers we've had in the past. I'm particularly indebted to our President-elect, Professor Larry Armstrong, for the invitation to be here today. And I think Larry perhaps asked me, and the welcome music gave you a clue, because of our shared Scottish heritage. And I know that Larry is extremely proud of the Scottish heritage that we both share. There is a difference, though. My forebears were from the Highlands of Scotland. They were wandering minstrels and scholars who were welcome everywhere. The Armstrong Clan, of course, lived on the borders of England, a lowland clan. They were notorious for stealing cattle and interfering with their neighbours' sheep. When I put the words Armstrong and Trust into a well-known search engine on the web, I came up with a member of the clan. I believe he was a professional cyclist. But of course, our President-elect has many great features, and I appreciate the invitation to be here. I should begin, as many people do these days, with a list of potential or real conflicts of interest. If you work in the field of sport nutrition and sports medicine, you often work with industry. I don't see that as a real conflict, but I do declare that I have worked with many of the big players in the field over the years. And as we heard in the introduction, David Bruce Dill made many contributions, a distinguished scientist who was a great supporter of the college over many, many years, and his legacy lives on today. He made enormous contributions to many areas of exercise science. And what I'm going to do today is not to try to give a comprehensive review of history of sport nutrition, because I know that the average age of our audience is rather less than my age. And younger people tend not to be interested in history for its own sake. So what I'm going to try and do is to give a selective view of a few issues that are highly relevant to what people do today. And I won't dwell on the work of Dill, which was prominent in this area, because I know that's been covered in this series of lectures before and is well known to this audience. But I will begin with a quote from the ethicist and essayist George Santayana. And he said, "Those who ignore history are bound to repeat it." I'm sure that many of you recognize this quote. And I see a few people nodding, so they do obviously recognize it. They're wrong, though, because that's not what he actually wrote. He said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Something similar, but not quite the same. So attention to detail is something that's important. But a knowledge of history is also important, because Santayana wrote this in 1905. In 1780, Edmund Burke said, "Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it." So we should give the credit where it belongs, not to Santayana, but to Edmund Burke. Now, I've spent some time over the last couple of days wandering around the exhibit hall, and in the exhibit hall are a number of publishers. Most of them feature several textbooks in the area of sport and exercise nutrition. And I browsed through quite a few of those, and the message, or one of the messages I take from those books, is that fatigue, at least in prolonged exercise, is primarily caused by running out of carbohydrate supply, so depletion of muscle glycogen and possibly also hypoglycemia, and that dehydration and also hypothermia are also major contributing factors to the fatigue we experience in prolonged exercise. And some of those books contain some qualifications. This applies certainly as regards the carbohydrate depletion to cycling exercise, perhaps less convincingly to running exercise. And it also applies perhaps rather more to exercise in a laboratory than it does to exercise in the field. And it applies perhaps more to exercise in a temperate environment than it does in a warm or hot environment. So some qualifications on the things that we all know. And we might think, where does that information come from? And when I read those textbooks, almost every one of them contains these graphs telling us that the importance of carbohydrate was recognized in the 1960s with the classic studies of Bengt Saltin on the left there, Eric Hultman on the right, and of colleagues in Scandinavia in the mid-1960s. They showed on the left there the curve showing glycogen depletion as exercise progresses, cycling exercise. In the middle, the classic study of Bergstrom and Hultman in Nature in 1966, showing that if you feed a high carbohydrate diet per se, it has little effect on muscle glycogen. But if that diet is preceded by exhausting exercise, we get glycogen supercompensation in the active muscle. And they showed in 1967 that the time for which exercise could be continued was influenced by the pre-exercise muscle glycogen content. So a high carbohydrate diet would improve exercise performance, a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, and exercise performance was poorer. These studies and the large number of other studies from the same few years depended on good ideas, men and women with vision and imagination who asked the right questions, and on the methodology. And of course, the introduction of the muscle biopsy technique allowed these mechanisms to be investigated. And many of us followed with muscle biopsy methods. It's a simple, non-invasive method that allows us to assess muscle metabolism. We can take biopsies before and after exercise, and this is what happens when you're short of help in the laboratory. You not only have to be subject for your own studies, you have to do your own muscle biopsies. But it does reassure those who haven't participated, it's a completely painless procedure. But we can trace this back a little bit further. And the difference is that if we want to study mechanisms, we need tissues. If we want to study phenomena, we don't need very sophisticated apparatus. So this is a paper from 1939 looking at performance of prolonged exercise after different diets. Essentially the study that Bergstrom and Hultman did. And what they showed is they looked at people on a normal diet, and this was what is classified as a normal diet, almost equal parts of carbohydrate and fat, a very high fat diet, and a very high carbohydrate diet. They had the subjects exercise to fatigue on the high fat and high carbohydrate diets, and the exercise for a fixed time on the normal diet. And you see here results from the 3 subjects who were participating. You can see on the normal diet, exercise time was intermediate typically between that and on the fat and carbohydrate diets. So feeding a high fat diet reduced exercise capacity, feeding a high carbohydrate diet increased exercise capacity. The same result that Bergstrom and Hultman found, but not supported by muscle measurements. And in those extremely productive years of the 1960s, there was also generated a lot of information on hydration, temperature regulation, and other factors contributing to fatigue in endurance exercise. And this is a study from another guy who had some good ideas and was willing to work on methodologies, Griffith Pugh. And we see here Griff Pugh on the left, who was responsible for the oxygen supply in the first successful Everest expedition, and this is at base camp talking to Edmund Hillary. He did many studies in relation to performance in altitude, and this is preparing for Mexico City Olympics. Griff Pugh is driving a somewhat battered old car. Someone is leaning out the window and collecting expired air samples from Bruce Tullow, the European 5,000-meter champion. So the ability to overcome difficulties with equipment, to do what's necessary to gain results. But he also used simple methods, and in the field, he went to a marathon near Oxford, persuaded the volunteers to allow rectal temperature to be measured afterwards, and he measured these temperatures on most of the runners who completed the marathon. Showed that some indeed were hypothermic, and with weight changes, he showed that many indeed were significantly dehydrated. But interestingly, he showed that those who performed best were the ones who were hottest. But he also showed those with the highest temperatures were more likely to fail to complete the course. But if we really want to think about the history of sport nutrition, we have to go much further back than the 1960s. And we have to go quite a long way back. And this is perhaps one of the greatest athletes of all time. This is Captain Barclay Allardyce from the northeast of Scotland. He was a pedestrian, a long-distance walker, and in 1809 he walked 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours. If you think about it, that's about 24 miles a day for 40 days. And that's not too difficult. Lots of people do that. It's really not that difficult. The real challenge was, in each succeeding hour, he had to do 1 mile. So if you think about it, there's not much of a break between 1 mile and the next for 40 days and 40 nights. And he was successful. And because he was so successful, people copied his training methods and people copied his diet. And this is a record of what he said about diet. He said the diet's very simple. Animal diet is alone prescribed, beef and mutton are preferred. Everything involving flatulency must be carefully avoided. So he got that bit right. Vegetables, such as carrots or potatoes, are never given. They are watery, difficult digestion. Fish must be avoided because it's not nutritious. No butter, no cheese, no eggs. It's a pretty minimalist diet. And in spite of that, he was incredibly successful. If you look at his preparation for major races, it was pretty severe. The keystones of the preparation were sweating, meat eating, and purging. And in spite of that, he achieved phenomenal performances. So we can see where some of the ideas of some athletes in today's world had their origins. But of course, things move on, and this is from the classic textbook of 1888 by Montague Shearman on athletics and football. And he said sweating, meat eating, and purging constituted the old system of training. We've moved on since those days. It was chiefly applied to men of the lower classes used to coarse foods and with no highly organized nervous system. And of course, professional football today is very similar. There is no highly organized nervous system. And he wrote that such a method could not be beneficial to an amateur who takes up athletic sports as a recreation and not as a business. And Shearman, of course, was one of the founders of the Amateur Athletics Association in England and was a bastion of the old school of amateurism. But he was also a sharp guy. And he said the ideal diet for a man in active training is that which would be best for a healthy man who is obliged to take a very large amount of active exercise. And I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And he went on to say, what that diet is a matter for scientists to decide, or to differ upon, as they usually do in such matters. So sport nutrition really hasn't changed that much, has it? Because if we look today, this is from the national news in the UK just a few weeks ago. Food fight, row over saturated fat advice. A row has erupted, the evidence is shaky, disagreements. If you look at some of the other areas today where there are disagreements, the world is polarized between those who think that carbohydrate is good and those who think that carbohydrate is evil. And the picture changes constantly, so we have to be nimble on our feet to keep up with everything that's emerging. For those who wish to be ahead of the game, you have to be aware of what's happening. And this is a report from Cell Reports, published yesterday, embargoed until yesterday, suggesting that at least in mice, a low-protein, high-carbohydrate diet has beneficial effects on cholesterol, insulin sensitivity, and lifespan in mice. So something perhaps for those who insist strongly on one side or the other to think about. We have an imperfect picture, and we shouldn't be overly certain about anything. And it was a wise man, Bertie Russell, who said, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people are full of doubts. So it behoves us to bear those doubts in mind as we look at the evidence that we have today. But again, we should go back and look at how we got to where we are today. Where did sport and exercise nutrition really begin to be set on a scientific footing? And one of the classic papers is that by Krogh and Lindhart, published in the Biochemical Journal in 1920. And if you look at this paper, and I would strongly advise everyone to do that, there's a huge amount of information. And one thing to note, if you look at the citation, the paper's 73 pages long. Can you imagine a high-impact journal today giving you 73 pages to describe a single study? The two authors, of course, extremely well known in the field. Krogh, one of the great physiologists of all time, Nobel Prize winner in 1920. And Krogh, in some ways, was the classic physiologist. He had good ideas, realized in order to do the right experiment, he needed two things. He needed the right question that was in search of an answer, and he needed the right equipment to allow him to answer that question. And he liked to build equipment. And he built this electrically braked cyclogometer in 1913, published it in Scandinavian Archives for Physiology. And of course, this was rapidly copied around the world, and this became the classic ergometer. So for the first time in the laboratory, we could have a standard exercise model that allowed the exercise subjects were doing to be measured and repeated in a reliable fashion. And very quickly, that spread to be the standard around the world. This is from Benedict's lab. And it's really not so different from the environment we had when I began my Ph.D. studies some years later. The world had not moved on very much in terms of equipment. But Krogh also needed to be able to measure substrate oxidation. And at the time, oxygen, carbon dioxide analysis were not sufficiently precise to give reliable measurements. So Krogh built a gas analysis system that allowed analysis to a precision of 0.001%. And if you think about the analyzers you use in the laboratory today, those exercise physiologists among us, they're nowhere near as good as that. They're not even 0.01%. This is the equipment that he built, and you'll see the health and safety precautions he followed with the white coat and all the other things we have to do today. And that equipment is still there in the institute named after him in Copenhagen today. And with a few modifications by Haldane and by Brian Lloyd, that's the equipment on which I embarked on my scientific career. And I would encourage all of you, go into your department store cupboard, search through the old stuff, dust down the old Haldane gas analyzer and use it. Because you can analyze samples much more accurately than you can with modern methods. And it's reliable, unlike modern analyzers. Anyway, using this equipment, Krogh was able to answer some of the questions that he asked. And this is one of the results from part of the study reported in that 1920 paper. And you see the four subjects, JL, Johannes Lindhart, Goran Lillestrand, one of the associate authors, August Krogh himself, and a professional subject who was the fourth subject. And I'll just make that text a little bit bigger to make it easier to read. And they wrote that the subjects observed distinct differences in the facility or difficulty with which the prescribed amount of work was performed. On fat diets, the fatigue became considerable and sometimes excessive. Subjects were generally very tired when on a fat diet and much less tired or not tired at all when on carbohydrates. So the practical message that was available in 1920 was not very different from the practical message as it relates to sport from the more sophisticated studies of Bergstrom, Saltine, and others in the 1960s. If you eat a high carbohydrate diet for a few days, performance is better. If you eat a high carbohydrate diet, it's a high fat diet, it's not as good. And there's some interesting information too in that paper. And we all know, those of us who work in the field, that if you measure the respiratory exchange ratio, or the RQ as they called it in those days, and it's about 0.7 or 0.71, then pretty much all the energy is coming from fat. And if it's at 1, then pretty much all the energy is coming from carbohydrate. And in the same table, they said that when we have a high rate of fat oxidation, the amount of energy we get from burning 1 liter of oxygen is about 4.8 calories. But when we're burning carbohydrate, the amount of energy we get from 1 liter of oxygen is just over 5 calories. And that difference may be very meaningful. And many people say that this was a finding made by Krogh and Lindhart. But if you read the small print at the bottom, it says calculated using data of Zunz 1901. So we have to go back to the library and find a paper of Nathan Zunz from 1901. And indeed, and for those who don't speak German as I don't, it tells us that when we're burning when we're burning protein or muscle flesh, then for each liter of oxygen, we get just over 4.7 calories. When we're burning fat, we get about 4.7 calories. And when we're burning carbohydrate, starch, we get just over 5 calories. So this was well known in 1900. And you can see the equipment they had was rather less sophisticated than that followed. And in the same laboratory in Nathan Zunz's lab, Frenzel and Reich published a study also in 1901 using 2 subjects themselves, but they made 176 separate measurements on those 2 subjects. And what they showed is that the theoretical calculation translates into reality. When they ate a high-fat diet, the respiratory quotient or respiratory exchange ratio was low, but look at the results of Frenzel at the top. The energy cost of doing work was higher on the fat diet than it was on the carbohydrate diet. And this was also true of Reich. So the energy cost of doing work depends on the substrate being oxidized. The physiology accords with the biochemistry. There was some debate because various people believed that carbohydrate was the only fuel for muscle and fat first had to be converted to carbohydrate, thus accounting for the lower efficiency of fat oxidation. A large number of studies published, but gradually the truth emerged, and this is a paper by Marsh and Merlin in 1928, and they showed the net efficiency on the normal diet, 22%, on the high carbohydrate diet, close to 23%, and on the high fat diet, lower at 21%. And this applied at 2 different power outputs. So when I began to do my PhD, we used diet and exercise to study metabolism. We looked at people on a normal diet, a low carbohydrate diet, and a high carbohydrate diet. We saw the expected changes in respiratory exchange ratio. We saw the expected changes in the oxygen cost. When people had consumed a low carbohydrate diet, they burned more fat, and they needed more oxygen to exercise at the same power output. We were very pleased to see these results because it told us our experiment was sound. It gave us the answers that we should get. You can imagine my surprise then to see this paper published in a prestigious journal last year, improved gross efficiency during long duration submaximal cycling following a short-term high carbohydrate diet. And this is the key result. On the high carbohydrate diet, the efficiency was higher than it was on the high fat or normal diets. But we knew that in 1901. Yet there's no reference to any of that extensive literature in the manuscript. And I say this not to be critical of the authors, but to point out that we need to remember what Santayana said when he plagiarized Ed Burke. But it does make us think that if it's not carbohydrate that's limited, but rather the oxygen supply, there's a definite advantage in using carbohydrate as a fuel. If you haven't got much oxygen, it makes sense to be as efficient as you possibly can. But I hear you say, there's simply not enough carbohydrate. We have to use fat if we're doing endurance exercise. And if you think about the marathon as an example, the energy cost of running, about 0.9 kilocalories per kilogram of body mass per kilometer covered. And if we take a 55 kilogram runner, that's 2,089 kilocalories to run a marathon. And that's 522 grams of carbohydrate if we used only carbohydrate. And that's a lot of carbohydrate to burn in a marathon. Why 55 kilos? Well, the current world record holder happens to weigh 55 kilos, and his running efficiency or running economy has been measured. So those are the data that I used. But if we look at the carbohydrate stores that are potentially available, we might say there should be close to 500 grams in the muscle after a high carbohydrate diet, if we're well rested. There might be as much as 100 grams in the liver on a good day. And if we believe the current information, the best information we have, we should be able to use exogenous carbohydrate at 1 gram a minute. Well, that adds up to substantially more than 522 grams of carbohydrate. Do we have that much available? And I'll cite a study from my former Ph.D. student, Yanis Pitsaladis, that was published a few years ago. And this was a heroic study, at least as far as the subjects were concerned. They exercised to exhaustion at 70% of VO2 max on 4 separate occasions, twice in the heat and twice in the cold. They did this after a high carbohydrate diet and after a low carbohydrate diet in each of those conditions. So in the cold, they could do 158 minutes after the high carbohydrate diet and only 89 minutes after the low carbohydrate diet. The sort of result we expect. Surprisingly, in the heat, the high carbohydrate diet also improved performance, even though it's quite clear that carbohydrate is not limiting. So I show this study for 2 reasons. One is to say that in the high carbohydrate diet on the cold, they oxidized, and this is measured carbohydrate oxidation based on oxygen uptake and respiratory exchange, about 430 grams of carbohydrate. And that's not including any exogenous carbohydrate because they consume none. And this is cycling, not running. With the bigger muscle mass involved in running, we might expect more carbohydrate to be available. So it's not unreasonable to say 522 grams of carbohydrate should be easily achievable. And of course, we also saw the same effects on oxygen uptake. A higher oxygen uptake on the high-fat diet and a lower oxygen uptake on the high carbohydrate diet. And this may go some way to explain the observed effect on endurance in the heat, where we know that carbohydrate is not limiting. Because if we do the sums and think about our 2,089 kilocalories, if we burn only carbohydrate, that needs 417 liters of oxygen. If we were to burn only fat, it would need 445 liters of oxygen. And that works out at 3.5 or 3.7 liters per minute over the duration of a marathon. For a 55 kilogram runner, that's either 63 or 67 mils per kilogram per minute. If we assume a VO2 max of 80 mils per kilogram per minute, on the high carbohydrate diet, a runner requires 79% of VO2 max to complete the race. On the high fat diet, our same runner needs 84% of VO2 max to complete the race. And I ask you, which would you rather be exercising at? 79% of your VO2 max or 84% of your VO2 max? So carbohydrate is an important fuel. The more we can use, the better. And I would venture to suggest if we look back at this evidence, we might say the challenge is not to spare carbohydrate by promoting fat use. The challenge is rather to increase carbohydrate storage and to increase carbohydrate utilization. And I realize that this is an area of some controversy, and there's a huge effort being devoted to trying to encourage adaptation to burn more fat. But I really don't understand why we would want to do that. Now, of course, I said that the subjects in the study I just mentioned didn't consume any carbohydrate, but we know that consuming carbohydrate just before or during exercise can help exercise performance. And we can trace this back a long way. And this is a paper from the Journal of Physiology in 1894, looking at 2 interventions. One is feeding sugar, and the other is smoking cigarettes. I think one would be more likely to get ethics committee approval than the other today, although that's debatable perhaps in some institutions. But he did show that feeding sugar improved exercise performance. So this was known before the end of the 19th century. And of course, again, in the 1920s, there was a great flurry of interest in what people ate before and during exercise, and Boston was an area of great activity here with the Harvard Fatigue Lab about to be set up and various other things happening. And these are results from the Boston Marathon, which was investigated in 1923 and 1924 by a group based in Harvard. And this is Chuck Meller about to win the 1925 race. And they showed that feeding carbohydrate before and potentially during the event could maintain blood glucose and could aid performance and at least decrease some of the adverse symptoms. And that began the trend of consuming carbohydrate, whether in solid form or in the more easily consumed liquid form, that persists to this day. And of course, that habit of drinking during running has led to some recent controversy. Well, perhaps not so recent, because 30 years ago, Tim Noakes was the first to identify the possibility that some people might drink too much. So drinking is important, but some people drink too much. And he identified a syndrome of water intoxication in a small number of people participating in long endurance events. But again, if we go back to our friend Captain Barclay Allardyce, he said it's an established rule to avoid liquids as much as possible, just take enough to quench your thirst. So the idea that we should drink as much as our thirst dictates is indeed quite a well-established idea in the literature. But in the 1920s, there was a somewhat more sophisticated investigation than Barclay Allardyce was able to carry out. And this is a paper from J.S. Haldane, and I'll just highlight some of the key things, because this came not from sports medicine, but from industrial medicine. And he said, men working in hot mines suffer greatly from a sensation of thirst, which appears to be in part due to a physical drying of the mucous membranes of the mouth and throat. They are therefore induced to take large quantities of water, so large as to be in excess of the real requirements of the body. So they're drinking more than they should. And he refers specifically to the symptom of cramp, but he said this is a form of water poisoning or water intoxication of the muscles, brought about by a combination of great loss of chloride, and the mentioned chloride rather than sodium as we would today, because it was relatively easy to measure chloride and almost impossible at the time to get a reliable measure for sodium. So you can substitute sodium. Chloride is simply a proxy for the sodium being lost in sweat. So large losses of sodium, excessive drinking, and what he referred to as a temporary paralysis of renal excretion. I think today we'd call that a syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. So these are indeed the keystones of what probably causes exercise-associated hyponatremia, recognized in 1923. And with that flurry of activity in the 1920s, of scientific activity with Krogh and Windhart, with the Boston Marathon studies, with the studies on hydration, there was, of course, a huge advance in performance in sport. And the outstanding athlete of the 1920s was Pavel Nurmi. You can see his career spanned the 1920s. His success at the Olympics was unparalleled in 1924. He won the 1,500 meters and the 5,000 meters with only 75 minutes between the two events. So his recovery powers were truly remarkable. What did he have to say about all of this? He said, mind is everything, muscles, pieces of rubber. I am all that I am because of my mind. And this is a common theme among highly successful athletes. They ascribe everything to the brain. Those failures like myself, of course, say, well, my brain's fine, but I just don't have the right muscle fiber types, or my cardiovascular system's not up to it. We find an excuse in the periphery, but maybe the failure is in the brain. And scientists should have listened a bit more closely what Pavel Nurmi was telling them, because it took a long time before people took this seriously. But Eric Newsholm in the 1980s said, well, there were some interesting things happening in the brain. And he was a biochemist with some outstanding insights into muscle biochemistry and indeed organ biochemistry, because he studied not only muscle, he studied various tissues and realized there were some interesting things happening, and interesting things happening in the brain. He was aware that serotonin, or 5-hydroxytryptamine, has a number of effects on the brain. It can cause tiredness and sleep. And possibly it may alter exercise performance. And he looked to say, what might drive this? And he realized that the uptake of the metabolic precursor into the brain, tryptophan, competes with the branched chain amino acids. So changes in the circulating concentration of these may influence tryptophan uptake into the brain. There's no further limitation on tryptophan, on 5-HT secretion. So Newsholm proposed a central fatigue hypothesis, where what's happening in the brain is really what's driving everything. And he looked for a nutritional basis. Can we manipulate the amino acid concentrations? Can we manipulate the uptake of tryptophan into the brain? And these studies produced very mixed results. We took a simpler approach and said, well, if serotonin, 5-HT, is really important, there are so many drugs out there that affect serotonin. If they do that, they should affect exercise performance. So we did a very simple study. We gave paroxetine, a 5-HT reuptake inhibitor, to a small group of healthy volunteers, and it significantly reduced exercise time. Exercise time reduced from 116 to 94 minutes. And there were no obvious metabolic, cardiovascular, or thermoregulatory effects. So we'd spent a huge amount of time looking to understand what was causing fatigue in these conditions, taking muscle biopsies, measuring cardiovascular responses, measuring skin blood flow, measuring core temperature, and perhaps we'd got it a little bit wrong. And I think this is entirely fair, and this is how you measure rectal temperature in someone who's just run a marathon. And contrary to what some people say, I am not either of the people in this picture. But it's easier to believe that important events relating to fatigue may be taking place in the brain than in the rectum. So we should look in the right place and ask the right question. Now, today, of course, we don't go to the library anymore to get our information. We've got a computer on our desk, and we use these computer-based sources of information. And if we want to investigate what the brain's doing, we can put in central governor. And Wikipedia, that infallible source of reliable scientific information, tells us that the central governor is a proposed process in the brain regulating exercise to prevent threats to homeostasis. It tells us that the existence of a central governor was proposed by Tim in 1997, but a similar idea was suggested in 1924 by A.V. Hill. Noakes created the idea of a central governor in the context of prolonged endurance running and proposed that pace is regulated to prevent catastrophic failure. And I'm sure you've all read many of these papers. But let's look back a little bit. This is from a textbook of exercise physiology by Francis Bainbridge, published in 1919, the year before he died. And he said it's long been recognized. So in 1919, he could say it has long been recognized. The main seat of fatigue after muscular exercise, he means, of course, during muscular exercise, is the central nervous system. Mossel long ago stated that nervous fatigue is the preponderating phenomenon, and muscular fatigue is also at bottom an exhaustion of the nervous system. But Bainbridge was a remarkably acute observer, as well as being remarkably literate. He said, there appear, however, to be two types of fatigue. One arising entirely within the central nervous system, the other in which the fatigue of the muscles themselves is superadded to that of the nervous system. No sophisticated measuring methods, no MRI, no PET scanner, but very good observation of what he sees when he watches somebody exercising. So really, perhaps, we should give the credit to Francis Bainbridge, because this is central fatigue. This is the central governor. But then if we go further back, Ferdinand Lagrange published a textbook of exercise physiology in French in 1885, but my French isn't sufficiently good, so I've used the English edition of 1889. And Lagrange wrote in this that fatigue is a kind of regulator, governor, it's the same thing, warning us we are exceeding the limits of useful exercise and that work will soon become dangerous. Numerous physiological phenomena show us the sensation of fatigue has its seat rather in the nerve centers than in the muscles. And again, no mechanistic studies possible at the time, but acute insight into what they're seeing in front of their eyes. And let's go back to that bit about pace being regulated to prevent catastrophic failure. This is not from a textbook of exercise physiology, but it's from a textbook of physiology. And there's a short chapter in this on exercise. And this is Bainbridge and Menzies' Essentials of Physiology, the 1957 edition. So even 40 years after his death, his name is still in the textbook. And he said, over a period of weeks, the brain learns how to control the muscles with the greatest efficiency. And he uses an example of a mile. If you set off very fast, you'll collapse towards the end and you won't run as fast as you could have done. If you set off too slowly, you've got something left for a sprint at the end, and you'll run too fast at the end, and you won't do as well as you could do. It's only after doing the mile a number of times the man learns the pace he should set himself just to complete the distance when his endurance is becoming exhausted. And this is a physiologist writing, not a coach, not an athlete, but somebody who looks and somebody who thinks. But we all know that, don't we? Watch little kids on sports day. They set off far too fast, and the ones who set off far too fast don't make it to the finish. The central governor, the pace regulator, isn't working. It's not an innate response. It's a learned response. I went too fast last time, I'll go a bit slower at the start this time. I could do a sprint at the finish, I'll go a bit faster earlier on next time. It's a simple, learned response. And catastrophic failure does happen. The governor does not prevent catastrophic failure. This is Dorando Pietri at the Olympics in 1908. He doesn't look too good, does he? This is Jim Peters in 1954 in the Empire Games in Vancouver. Didn't make it to the finish. And this is the Swiss lady, Anderson Schiess, in Los Angeles in 1984. I think you agree these are pretty catastrophic failures. And it happens to elite, highly trained athletes too. Number 2 in the picture is Steve Jones, British athlete, extremely successful, extremely talented, on his way to winning the London Marathon in 1985. And this is his marathon running record. His first 3 marathons, he finished in first place with an average time of just inside 2 hours and 8 minutes. So about 63, 64 minutes for each half of the race. He decided in Stuttgart in the European Championships in 1986 to run a little bit faster and see what happened. So he did about 62 minutes for the first half, and he saw what happened. He did 80 minutes for the second half. That's a pretty catastrophic failure. The regulator is not perfect. And I'd like to take the last few minutes to finish with thinking a little bit about some of the nutrition issues rather than some of the science issues that underpin the nutrition. Because of course we've seen enormous changes over the last 100 or 200 years in the foods we eat, the availability of the foods. And we've seen huge differences in what athletes actually do. And the hosting of the last Olympic Games in London in 2012 provided a good example to look back and review some of those changes, because of course this was the 3rd time the Games had taken place in London. The first in 1908, the second in 1948, and the 3rd in 2012. And I'm sorry the text is perhaps a little bit small to see, but there are substantial changes over that period in what happened at an Olympic Games. In 1908, the Games were spread over a period of 7 months. There wasn't a single festival lasting a few weeks as there is today. There were about 2,000 competitors, of whom only a handful were women. There was a new stadium built. There was no athletes' village. The athletes stayed in hotels. In 1948, there were about 4,000 athletes. Still, only a handful of women. There was still no athletes' village. This was the post-war period. The athletes were accommodated in army barracks, in hostel accommodation, and the women, of course, were strictly segregated. We didn't want the genders mixing at an Olympic Games, so they stayed in hotels in London. By 2012, the world had changed. The athletes are superstars, and they expect 5-star luxury and 5-star accommodation, and the 10,500 athletes, of whom half were women, indeed had a phenomenal village to live in and had fantastic catering. 1908, of course, seems a world away. The Games were not meant to be there. It was all a little bit rushed. But you look at the athletes taking part, they belong to a different era. These are not modern athletes in the sense. Conditions were different. Not surprisingly, the nutrition strategies were very different from what we'd expect today. In 1948, we're moving closer to something like today's athlete, but it's still a different world. 1948 was soon in the aftermath of the war that caused problems around the world. Food rationing in the UK was still in place. Food was in short supply. Athletes were asked to bring their own food from their home countries with them. And athletes were provided with some meals. You can see the two athletes in the picture here looking a little bit uncertainly at an egg. For many people, eggs were something they hadn't seen for a long time. So we may look and say the food provision was poor. For many of these people, the food provision was better than they were accustomed to. And of course, the provision of refreshments for athletes at various competition venues was somewhat different from what it was today. They were expected to mix with the spectators and consume the same foods the spectators consumed. Other things are recognizably different from today. Weigh-in was still an important part of some competitive events, but I don't think this method of weighing in for a wrestling competition would be considered acceptable today. And in 2012 in London, the Athletes' Village provided 5-star catering 24 hours a day. You can see some of the statistics there on the amounts of food that's expected to be consumed in the Athletes' Village. They expect access to everything they want whenever they want it. And there were a number of issues relating to food that emerged in London that would not have been considered in previous years. A huge focus on sustainability of food supply. So on the one hand, there's a need to balance the request of the athlete to have unlimited food at all times of day with challenges of sustainability. The IOC is under enormous pressure to show that it's aware of the environmental impact of hosting an Olympic Games and not to waste those precious resources. There's a focus on local and seasonal food while still recognizing that athletes traveling from different cultures want to have their own types of food available. There's an increased awareness among athletes and those supporting them of the need to be aware of what they're eating. So foods have to be labeled. There's an expectation that the nutrient contents of foods will be made very clear. So that became a major issue. For the first time at an Olympic Games, the issue of Ramadan fasting became an issue. And the Games overlapped with Ramadan. So those Muslim competitors were faced with a choice. Do they fast and observe their religious strictures, or do they delay their fasting and put their performance as their first priority? And that raises some major challenges. Not a challenge in previous years, because Ramadan didn't overlap with the Games, and the number of Muslim competitors was very small. But today, this is a major issue. And the issue of food safety has emerged as something that wouldn't have been considered before. The possibility there may be contamination of the food that can lead to a positive doping test, and that has been documented. The possibility that somebody may interfere with the food supply in some way and put the performance and indeed the health of the athletes in jeopardy. So those became major issues in the nutrition field, which are completely new and had not been considered previously. But we look at the world of sport today and we wonder where we're going. This is the current world record holder for the marathon, 2 hours, 2 minutes, and 57 seconds. It's only a question of time, surely, before that 2-hour marathon is broken. How long will it be? Will it be a year? Will it be 10 years? Will it be 20 years? And of course, we don't know the answer, and that's the fascination of sport. And the other extreme of performance, we see incredible performances in the sprints. In my lifetime, the world record for the 100 meters has come down by about half a second. When I was young, the idea that somebody could run more or less 9.5 seconds for 100 meters was inconceivable. So who's to say that in the lifetime of many of the people here, there won't be another half second taken off the record, and some of you will live to see 100 meters run in 9 seconds. Do you think so? Is it going to happen? And we don't know. And what will be the role of nutrition in helping those advances move forward. So what I've tried to do in the last 45, 50 minutes or so is to highlight some of the issues that I think are important, some of the things we should remember but have forgotten, and some of the things that, if we didn't know them, we should go back and learn them, because they can help guide what we do today. And I've been highly selective, of course, because there have been many wrong turnings and blind alleys along the way, and I could equally well have devoted the last 45 minutes to saying, look at all these silly things that people did over the years. Look at what they used to believe, which we now know to be completely wrong. But we have to be careful, because what we now know to be true may be seen tomorrow to be completely false. And I'll just begin with one last comment on the role of nutrition in sports performance. It's important, but it's not that important. Because as Harry Redknapp, that well-known British soccer coach, said, if you can't pass a football, a plate of pasta is not going to make that much difference to the result. So this is how highly valued the field of sport nutrition is by the professionals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ron, that was terrific, fantastic Dill lecture. On behalf of the college, thank you again for a terrific lecture and presenting with this plaque. So, again,
thank you.
Ron.
Thanks.
Ron.